If you have a pension pot worth 750,000 or more and you've always planned to leave it untouched because it sits outside inheritance tax, April 2027 might force you to rethink your entire estate strategy. Because this is not just a pension question, it is an estate planning question. A lot of sensible families built their planning around one quiet instruction: spend the ISA first, use savings next, leave the pension alone. Let that pass later. And if that has shaped your will, your nominations, and the order you expect to use your assets, one date can unsettle all of it. Not because everyone suddenly has a problem, but because a shortcut that used to hold the plan together may not hold in the same way after April 2027. So the useful question is not, is my pension good or bad? It is, if that pension is no longer sitting safely off to one side in inheritance tax planning, what else in my estate plan stops making sense? Now think about why this belief became so embedded. For years, many advisors and families treated the pension as the last asset to touch. It felt efficient in plain English. You live on other assets, you preserve the pension, you let it sit there for your spouse, children, or other beneficiaries. And because it was mentally kept separate from the rest of the estate, a lot of wider planning grew around that one idea. So the will was drafted with that in mind, the gifting pattern was shaped with that in mind, the property might have been left alone with that in mind. Even the emotional story of the plan was built around it. The pension was for the children, or the house goes one way and the pension goes another. Families get used to that structure, it starts to feel settled. And April 27 matters because it is expected to be the point where pensions may need to be considered much more directly in the inheritance tax picture. I'm choosing those words carefully because this depends on the final rules and on personal circumstances, but as a planning trigger, it is a real one. If we pause there for a second, two things often get blurred together. One is who receives the pension. The other is how the value of the pension may be treated for inheritance tax. Those are not the same question. You can still have nominated beneficiaries, that still matters. But if the tax treatment shifts, the wider estate maths can shift, even if the pension still ends up with the same person. Now let's make that a bit more concrete and go through that. An example. Take David and Mira. They're fictional, but very close to families I kind of speak to. They're in their late 60s, house largely paid off, some savings, a modest investment account, and a pension that has grown far more than they expected. Their estate plan was built a few years ago around a very clear idea: leave the pension untouched for as long as possible. So they draw the from cash, then from their investments, then keep the pension in the background. Their wills broadly divide things the way they want. Their pension nominations name the intended beneficiaries. On paper, it all feels organised, but now let's look at the shape of the wealth, not just the documents. The pension is one of the largest parts of the family's overall wealth. Let's put some kind of simple figures on that. Say David and Mira have a house worth 650k, savings and investments of 300k, and a pension worth 800k. That gives them total family wealth of about 1.75 million. Before April 27, if the pension sits outside the inheritance tax calculation, the part exposed to inheritance tax is the house plus the savings and investments, which is about 950k. Now, use the standard combined allowances. Many married couples aim to preserve the 325,000 nil rate band and the 175k each as a residential nil rate band. So together, they have about £1 million of inheritance tax free estate. On those figures, the taxable estate before April 27 is 950k minus 1 million, so no inheritance tax exposure at all for that example, £0. Now compare that with the same family after April 27. The pension is brought into inheritance tax picture in the way many people are now preparing for. The state for inheritance tax purposes is no longer 950k, it's the full 1.75 million. So take off 1 million of the combined allowances and you're left with 750k exposed to inheritance tax. At 40%, that creates a potential inheritance tax bill of 300k. So the shift in this example is stark. Before April 27, zero. After April 27, potentially about 300k. And that's exactly why David and Mira's old plan may need a second look. Not because the beneficiaries changed, not because the will stopped working, because the inheritance tax exposure changed by 300k, and the family may need to find that cash from somewhere else. If pension wealth starts being counted more directly in the inheritance tax picture from April 27, David and Mira may no longer be looking at a protected back pocket sitting outside the estate planning conversation. They may be looking at a large pool of value that changes the exposure of the whole family arrangement. And then kind of the ripple starts. Suddenly the old spending order may not be the best or the most clever order to spend. The will may still be legally valid, but no longer matched to the tax outcome they thought they were creating. The gifting they delayed may need a second look. And the question nobody asked before becoming urgent very quickly after death, where does the cash come from to pay the tax? Because tax is one issue, but funding it is another. In the real world, families do not deal with the inheritance tax in theory. They deal with it in cash. Which account is used? What has to be sold? Does something feel pressured to touch investments at the wrong time? Does a house get dragged into a conversation the parents thought they'd kept separate? That is why this is bigger than a pension technicality. If your whole plan was built on preserving the pension and using everything else first, and that pension no longer sits outside the picture in the way you expected, you can end up with the wrong assets spent, the wrong assets preserved, and the wrong source of cash left behind for the family to manage. Now, who needs to look at this first? Usually, the people most exposed are not beginners. It is the person who feels sorted because the planning was done under an older assumption. So, if your pension is now one of your biggest assets, bigger than it was when the will was signed, this should get your attention. If your estate plan quietly relies on the phrase, leave the pension till last, this should get your attention. If your children are meant to receive one type of asset and your spouse another, and that balance depends on the pension being treated separately, then yes, this should get your attention. If you have not reviewed your nominations, will, and drawdown thinking since your pension rose sharply, this should get your attention. And if most of your available cash in the estate sits outside the pension, while the pension itself carries a large slice of the value, this should really get your attention because families can end up asset rich on paper and cash poor exactly in the wrong moment. A good checkpoint is to stop asking, will the pension still go where I want? And ask, does the pension still fit the same story as the rest of my estate? That is the better test because a signed will is not the whole structure. A nomination is not the whole structure. And a tax efficient idea from a few years ago is not automatically a tax efficient idea after a rule change. Now, people sometimes react to this in the wrong way. They hear that April 27 may change the treatment and they jump straight to action, withdraw the pension, move money around, force a quick gift, rewrite everything in a hurry. That is usually the wrong energy. This is not a panic withdrawal story, it's a review story. You're not trying to win a race against the calendar with rushed product decisions. You're trying to check whether your current estate still works as one joined up plan. So, what do you sense check? First, whether the pension has become too large a part of the estate picture to keep treating it as a side issue. Second, whether your current drawdown order still makes sense if the old shelter logic weakens. Third, whether your will and your pension nominations are still telling the same story. And fourth, where the practical cash pressure would fall if tax had to be dealt with after death, not in theory, in actual pounds from actual assets. Because a family can be perfectly aligned emotionally and still run into structural problems if there's no easy source of cash. So if you've been carrying around the old mental shortcut that the pension is a safe asset to leave untouched, April 27 is a sensible point to test that shortcut, not just trust it. Check the current position against official guidance as it develops, and if your estate is large enough for this to matter, have the whole arrangement looked at together rather than treating the pension in isolation. A pension can still be a very valuable part of the plan, but if the plan was built on separation and the rules pull that pension back into the wider picture, the part to review is not just the pension, it is your whole estate plan.